The sun beat down on the Nebraska plains with merciless intensity, turning the earth hard as iron and making every breath feel like inhaling fire. But Willa Kendrick refused to stop working even though her hands had long since blistered and bled through the rough fabric she'd wrapped around them. She was 22 years old and alone on 80 acres of stubborn land outside Taylor, Nebraska, in the summer of 1882. And if she didn't get this field plowed and planted within the week, she wouldn't have enough food to see herself through the coming winter. Her father had died 3 months prior from pneumonia. Her mother had passed 2 years before that from consumption, and her only brother had been killed in a railway accident when she was just 17. The farm was hers now, along with all the backbreaking work that came with it, and there wasn't a soul in town who believed a woman could manage it alone. The plow was heavy, designed for a man's strength and a mule's pulling power, but her mule had gone lame last week, and she'd had to put the animal down herself. The memory of that still made her throat tight. Now she was pulling the plow herself, step by agonizing step, trying to turn over enough soil to plant at least a few acres of winter wheat. Her shoulders screamed in protest, her back felt like it might snap in two, and sweat poured down her face despite the bonnet she wore. She'd given up on dresses for field work, instead wearing her father's old trousers cinched tight with rope and one of his shirts that hung loose on her frame. The women in town had already written her off as peculiar, so she figured she might as well dress for practicality. She heard the horse before she saw it, the steady clip-clop of hooves on the hard-packed road that ran past her property. Willa didn't look up, didn't want to see the inevitable stares or worse, the pity. She'd had enough of both to last a lifetime. But the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped, and she felt the weight of someone's gaze on her back. "That's killing work for one person," a man's voice called out, deep and measured with no pity in it that she could detect, especially without a proper animal to help. "I'm managing," Willa said through gritted teeth, not stopping her work. She leaned into the plow handles, trying to force the blade deeper into the resistant earth. "I can see that. But managing and doing it right are two different things." She heard him dismount, the creak of leather and the soft thud of boots hitting ground. "You're going to break your back or the plow, probably both, before you turn over half an acre at that rate." Willa stopped then, straightening up slowly because her back had locked up something fierce. She turned to look at the stranger and found herself facing a tall man in his mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered oak. He wore the typical cowboy attire, dusty from travel, with a worn leather vest over a dark shirt and a gun belt slung low on his hips. His face was tanned and honest-looking, with a strong jaw that was rough with several days of stubble. There was something steady about him, like a tree that had weathered many storms and remained standing. "I don't recall asking for commentary on my work," she said, but her voice came out more tired than sharp. "No, you didn't." He walked past her to the plow, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who knew farming equipment. "My name's Quinn O'Connor. I'm passing through on my way to Colorado, but I can spare a day if you need help getting this field turned." Willa stared at him, suspicious of any man offering help without naming his price. "And what would you want in return?" Quinn looked at her directly, and she saw no guile in his expression, only a simple honesty that was rare in her experience. "A hot meal and a place to sleep in your barn tonight if you've got one. My horse could use the rest, and I wouldn't mind sleeping under a roof for once. That's all." "That's all." He had already moved to the plow, testing the handles, checking the blade. "This needs sharpening before we go much further, and the coupling's loose. You got tools?" Something in Willa's chest loosened, a tension she'd been carrying for months. She nodded toward the barn. "In there." Everything my father had. Quinn nodded and set to work without any further discussion, leading his horse to the barn and emerging a few minutes later with a file and wrench. Willa watched him work on the plow, his movements efficient and sure. He wasn't making a show of it, wasn't performing for her benefit. He was just doing the work that needed doing, and something about that made her trust him more than any words could have. "You know farming," she observed, moving to sit on an overturned bucket nearby. Her body sagged with relief at the chance to rest. "Grew up on a farm in Missouri," Quinn said, not looking up from his work. "Worked it until I was 20, then my father lost it to the bank. He couldn't take the shame of it and shot himself. My mother went to live with her sister in St. Louis, and I headed west. Been working cattle ranches mostly, moving from place to place." The casual way he mentioned his father's death told Willa that he understood loss, really understood it. She found herself speaking before she'd made the conscious decision to do so. "My father died in April. Pneumonia. Before that, it was my mother, then my brother. So now it's just me and this land, and I'm determined to keep it even if it kills me." Quinn looked up at her then, really looked at her, and she saw recognition in his eyes. Not pity, but understanding. "Land's worth fighting for," he said simply. "Gives you something to build on, something that's yours. I respect that." He finished sharpening the blade and tightening the coupling, then stood, dusting off his hands. "I'll pull it," he said. "I'm stronger than you, no offense meant. You guide it, keep it straight and at the right depth. We'll get a lot more done that way." Willa wanted to protest, to insist she could do it herself, but practicality won out over pride. She was exhausted and he was right. Together they could accomplish more. So she nodded and took position at the handles, while Quinn rigged up a harness from rope and leather straps he found in the barn, fitting it over his shoulders and chest. They worked through the afternoon, and Willa found herself fascinated by Quinn's quiet competence. He didn't complain about the heat or the heavy work, just leaned into the harness and pulled with steady determination. When she called out adjustments, he followed them without question, trusting her knowledge of her own land. They developed a rhythm, a partnership that felt natural despite having just met. By the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they turned over 3 times what Willa had managed in the previous 2 days. Her arms ached from guiding the plow, but it was the good ache of work accomplished rather than the desperate futility she'd felt before. Quinn straightened from the harness, rolling his shoulders. "That's good progress. Tomorrow we can finish this field and maybe start on another section if you want." Tomorrow, Willa had assumed he meant just today. "I said I was passing through, and I am, but I'm in no particular hurry. Colorado will still be there in a few days." He met her eyes. "You could use the help, and I don't mind giving it. Same terms, meals and a place in the barn." Willa's throat felt tight. She'd been alone for so long, carrying everything by herself, and now this stranger was offering help with no strings attached beyond basic hospitality. "Why would you do that?" Quinn was quiet for a moment, looking out over the partially plowed field. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. And I know what it's like when someone reaches out a hand when you need it most. A rancher in Wyoming did that for me when I was down to my last dollar and about ready to give up. Gave me work and a place to stay, treated me fair. He told me to pass it on when I could." He shrugged. "So I am. I don't know what to say. Thank you works, or let's eat works even better. I'm hungry enough to eat a horse, though I'd prefer not to." Despite everything, Willa laughed, the sound surprising her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. "I can do better than horse. I've got salt pork and beans, fresh bread I made yesterday, and some dried apple pie." "Now that sounds like heaven." They walked back to the house together, Quinn leading his horse to the barn first to unsaddle and brush down the animal. Willa went inside and lit the lamps, suddenly seeing her home through a stranger's eyes. It was clean but spare, showing the wear of people who had little money for anything beyond necessities. The furniture was handmade and sturdy, the curtains were faded calico, and the whole place had an air of faded gentility, of people who had once hoped for better things. She set about warming the food, slicing the bread and setting the table for two. It felt strange to set two places instead of just one, strange but good. Quinn came in a few minutes later, having washed up at the pump outside. His hair was damp and slicked back, and he'd brushed most of the dust from his clothes. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but this is a nice place," Quinn said, looking around. "Solid house. Your father built it." "He did with my mother's father back in '68 when they first claimed the land. They had big plans for this place." Willa brought the food to the table. "Sit, please." They ate in companionable silence at first, both too hungry for much conversation. But gradually, as the edge came off their appetites, they began to talk. Quinn told her about the places he'd seen, the ranches he'd worked, the vast spaces of the Western Territories. He spoke of Montana and Wyoming, of Colorado's mountains and Kansas's endless plains. He had a way of describing things that made them come alive, and Willa found herself leaning forward, hungry for these glimpses of a world beyond her farm. In turn, she told him about Taylor, about the families who had settled this area, about the struggles and small triumphs of making a life on the Nebraska plains. She told him about her father's dreams of building a bigger house, of having cattle as well as crops, of creating something lasting for his children and grandchildren. She didn't mention that those dreams had died with him, but she suspected Quinn understood that without her saying it. "Your father would be proud of you," Quinn said quietly. "Fighting to keep his land, working yourself to the bone to honor what he built, that takes courage." Willa felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "Most people in town think I'm being foolish. They think I should sell the land and move to Lincoln or Omaha, find work as a seamstress or a shop girl, maybe find a husband who will take care of me. Is that what you want?" "No." The word came out fierce and immediate. "This land is mine. It's all I have left of my family, of everything we worked for. I won't give it up without a fight." Quinn nodded slowly. "Then you fight for it, and for what it's worth, I don't think you're being foolish at all." After dinner, Willa sent Quinn to the barn with blankets and a pillow, refusing his offer to help with the dishes. She needed some time alone to process the day, to understand what it meant that this stranger had appeared and changed everything. She stood at the window, watching the light from his lantern glowing in the barn, and felt something shift inside her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the relief of not being entirely alone anymore. She didn't let herself think beyond tomorrow. That was dangerous territory. Quinn would help her finish the plowing, maybe stay a day or two more, and then he'd move on to Colorado or wherever his wandering took him. That was the way of cowboys, she knew. They never stayed in one place long. But for now, for tonight, it was enough that he was here. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorching day. Willa was up before sunrise, as was her habit, and had coffee and breakfast ready when Quinn emerged from the barn. They ate quickly and got to work, falling back into the rhythm they'd established the previous day. The plow moved steadily through the earth, and Willa marveled at how much difference Quinn's help made. What would have taken her weeks alone, they would finish in days. As they worked, they talked more, the conversation flowing easily. Quinn told her about learning to break horses, about a blizzard he'd survived in Montana that had buried his bunkhouse under 6 feet of snow, about the time he'd helped drive cattle across the Platte River during spring flooding. His life had been full of adventure and hardship in equal measure, and Willa found herself captivated by his stories. She shared her own memories in return, smaller in scope but no less meaningful. She told him about her mother teaching her to make bread, about her father letting her help with the planting even when she was so small she could barely lift a seed bag, about her brother teaching her to ride and shoot. She spoke of the quilting bees and barn dances, of neighbors helping each other through hard times, of the tight-knit community that had formed in this harsh land. "You miss him," Quinn observed. "Your brother." "Every day. Thomas was only 19 when he died. He just started courting Mary Elizabeth from the next farm over. They were planning to get married the next spring." Willa's voice caught. "She married someone else last year. I can't blame her. Life doesn't wait for grief to pass." "No, it doesn't." Quinn was quiet for a moment. "But that doesn't mean we forget." They finished the first field by midday and started on a second, smaller plot that Willa wanted to use for vegetables. Quinn proved knowledgeable about crop rotation and soil management, offering suggestions that Willa recognized as sound. He wasn't trying to take over or tell her what to do, just sharing what he knew, and she appreciated the difference. That evening, after another good meal, Quinn hesitated before heading to the barn. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "if you wanted, I could stay a bit longer. Help you get the seeds in the ground, make sure everything's planted right. Maybe fix some of the things around here that need fixing. That fence by the road is leaning pretty bad, and your barn door doesn't hang straight." Willa's heart gave a strange little leap. "You do that." "I would. If you're comfortable with it." He looked at her steadily. "I know it's not entirely proper, me staying here with you being alone, but I'd never do anything to compromise your reputation, Miss Kendrick. You have my word on that." "It's Willa. And at this point, my reputation in town is already compromised by the simple fact of running this farm alone. I wear men's clothes and do men's work. The respectable ladies already cross the street when they see me coming." She smiled wryly. "But I'd be grateful for your help, Quinn. More grateful than I can say." "Then I'll stay, at least until the planting's done and the repairs are made." Over the following days, they fell into a comfortable routine. They rose with the sun, worked through the morning, took a break during the worst heat of midday, and worked again until evening. Quinn's presence transformed the farm. The plowing was finished, the seeds were planted in neat rows, and the fields that had looked so forlorn and desolate now held the promise of future harvest. He repaired the fence, fixed the barn door, patched the roof where it had started to leak, and rebuilt the front steps that had been getting dangerously rickety. But more than the physical work, Quinn's presence transformed Willa herself. She smiled more, laughed more, felt the crushing weight of isolation lift from her shoulders. They talked constantly, sharing their thoughts and opinions on everything from politics to religion to the best way to make biscuits. They discovered they agreed on most important things and enjoyed arguing about the rest. Quinn had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and she found she had the ability to make him laugh with her sharp observations about people and life. She began to notice small things about him. The way he always made sure she ate enough before he took a second helping. How he'd leave wildflowers on the porch railing, never making a fuss about it, just setting them there for her to find. The gentleness with which he handled his horse and the barn cat that had appeared from somewhere and adopted them. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and how that smile came more easily as the days passed. Willa was no fool. She knew what was happening, could feel herself falling for this quiet, steady man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. It terrified her. She'd never been in love before, had never had time for courting with all the work and family obligations. And Quinn was a drifter, a man who'd spent years moving from place to place. Even if he felt something for her, and she wasn't sure he did, what future could they have? But she couldn't stop her heart from opening to him, couldn't prevent the warmth that flooded through her when he smiled at her, couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched. She was falling in love, helplessly and completely, and there wasn't a thing she could do to stop it. Quinn, for his part, was experiencing his own revelation. He'd spent 5 years drifting, telling himself he liked the freedom, the lack of ties. But working this land with Willa, eating meals across from her, talking with her as the stars came out, he realized what he'd really been doing was running. Running from the pain of losing his father and his family home, running from the risk of putting down roots only to have them torn up again, running from the vulnerability of caring about anything too much. But Willa made him want to stop running. She was the bravest person he'd ever met, fighting impossible odds with nothing but determination and will. She was smart and funny and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fancy dresses or artifice, and everything to do with strength of character. When she laughed, which she did more often now, it felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. When she was serious, discussing the farm or her plans for the future, he found himself wanting to be part of those plans. He was in love with her. The realization hit him one evening as he watched her kneading bread dough, her sleeves rolled up and flour dusting her forearms. She was humming softly, some tune he didn't recognize, and the lamplight turned her hair to gold. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life watching her make bread, listening to her hum, being part of her world. The question was whether she could possibly feel the same way about a rootless cowboy with nothing to offer but his willingness to work, and a heart that was entirely hers. 2 weeks after Quinn's arrival, they made a trip into Taylor for supplies. Willa needed seed for the kitchen garden, and some other items she couldn't produce herself. Quinn rode beside her wagon, and they talked comfortably as they covered the 5 miles to town. It was Saturday, so the town was busy with farm families doing their weekly shopping and cowboys from nearby ranches spending their pay. Willa felt the stares as soon as they arrived. She was used to being an object of curiosity and disapproval, but having Quinn with her added a new dimension. She could practically hear the gossip starting as they hitched up outside the general store. Quinn seemed oblivious to it, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He helped her down from the wagon with easy courtesy and walked beside her into the store. Inside, the proprietor, Mr. Jennings, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Miss Kendrick, sir, what can I do for you today?" Willa ran through her list while Quinn browsed, examining tools and equipment with professional interest. She was aware of the other customers watching them, whispering behind their hands. When she went to pay, Mr. Jennings said, "That'll be $3.40, unless you need to put it on account again." The hint of judgment in his voice made Willa's cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Quinn appeared at her elbow. "I'll get this," he said casually, pulling out his money. "That's not necessary," Willa said quickly. "I know, but you've been feeding me well for 2 weeks. Consider it my contribution to the household." He paid before she could argue further, then gathered up her parcels. As they left the store, they nearly collided with a woman in an expensive day dress, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed under a fashionable bonnet. She looked at Willa with barely concealed disdain, her gaze traveling over the worn work dress and practical boots. "Willa, I heard you were still trying to run that farm alone. How quaint." "Hello, Constance." Willa kept her voice level. Constance Martin had been her chief tormentor since childhood, always ready with a cutting remark or false sympathy. "And who's this?" Constance turned her attention to Quinn, her expression shifting to something calculating and flirtatious. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Constance Martin. My father owns the bank." "Quinn O'Connor," Quinn said politely but without warmth. He didn't elaborate, and Willa saw Constance's frustration at being given so little to work with. "Are you new to Taylor, Mr. O'Connor? I'm sure I'd remember seeing you before." "Just helping Miss Kendrick with her farm for a bit." Quinn's hand touched the small of Willa's back, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "We should be getting back. Long ride and there's work to do." "Of course. Well, it was lovely to meet you." Constance's smile was sharp. "Goodbye, Willa. Do give my regards to your family." "Oh, that's right, you don't have any left, do you? How tragic." Willa felt the words like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Quinn stepped forward. His voice was still polite, but there was steel underneath it. "That was cruel and unnecessary, Miss Martin. I don't know what kind of people you're used to associating with, but where I come from, kicking someone when they're down is the mark of a coward and a bully. You might want to think about that." He guided Willa toward the wagon, leaving Constance sputtering behind them. Once they were out of earshot, Willa let out a shaky laugh. "You didn't have to do that. I'm used to Constance's poison." "That doesn't make it right." Quinn's jaw was tight with anger. "What's her problem with you?" "I don't know. We grew up together and she's always been like that. Maybe she resents that my family had land when hers had money, or maybe she's just mean by nature." Willa climbed into the wagon. "Thank you for defending me, though. No one's done that in a long time. They should." "You deserve better than that." Quinn mounted his horse, then looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You deserve a lot better than how this town treats you." They headed back to the farm, but the encounter with Constance had stirred up painful memories for Willa. As they rode, she found herself talking about the loneliness of the past few years, the way the community that had once rallied around her family had gradually withdrawn as death took her parents and brother. Some of it was her own fault, she acknowledged. She'd been so wrapped up in grief and survival that she'd pushed people away. But some of it was the simple fact that she made people uncomfortable. A woman alone wasn't supposed to be capable or independent. It challenged their ideas about how the world should work. "I used to dream about leaving," she admitted. "Just selling everything and starting over somewhere no one knows me, but I could never do it. This land is soaked with my family's sweat and blood and tears. Leaving would feel like betraying them." "I don't think they'd see it that way," Quinn said quietly. "Your family would want you to be happy. They'd want you to have a life, not just survival." "Maybe, but this is the life I've chosen, for better or worse." That night after supper, they sat on the porch together watching the sun set. It had become their evening ritual, these quiet moments of companionship as day faded to night. Usually they talked, but tonight they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Quinn spoke. "I need to tell you something." His voice was serious, and Willa felt her stomach clench with anxiety. This was it, she thought. He was going to say he was leaving. "I came here by accident," Quinn continued. "Just passing through like I told you, and I meant to stay one day, maybe two. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being a stopover and started being something else." He turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes were dark and earnest. "I've been drifting for 5 years, Willa. Never staying anywhere long, never letting myself care too much about anything or anyone. But being here with you, it made me realize what I've been missing, what I've been running from." Willa's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to leave. I'm saying I've fallen in love with you and with this place, and with the life we could build together if you'd have me." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. I know I don't have much to offer. I've got my horse, my saddle, some tools, and about $200 saved. But I'm a hard worker and I'll never stop fighting for you and this farm if you'll let me stay. I'll spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of you." Tears were streaming down Willa's face, but she was smiling. "Quinn, you've been worthy since the moment you stopped and picked up that plow. Since you saw someone struggling and decided to help without asking anything in return. Don't you see? You've already given me everything that matters. You've given me hope and partnership and laughter. You've made me feel less alone, and I've fallen in love with you too, so completely that it scares me. So, is that a yes?" There was vulnerability in Quinn's voice, a fear of rejection that made him even more dear to her. "That's a yes, to all of it. To you staying, to building a life together, to everything." She squeezed his hand. "But I need you to be sure. This is hard country, Quinn. The farm barely makes enough to sustain itself. There will be drought years and grasshopper years and years when nothing goes right. It's not an easy life." "I don't want easy, I want real. I want a home and a partner and something to build toward." Quinn stood and drew her to her feet, his hands framing her face. "I want you, Willa Kendrick, if you'll have me. I will, I do." She rose on her toes and kissed him, a gentle brush of lips that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. Quinn made a soft sound and pulled her closer, deepening the kiss. It was sweet and passionate and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "We should probably get married," Quinn said, a smile playing at his lips. "Make it proper and all that." "Are you proposing to me, Quinn O'Connor?" "I am. Right here and right now, under these stars on this land that's going to be ours. Willa Kendrick, will you marry me?" "Yes," Willa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Taylor. Willa wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved, and Quinn bought a new suit for the occasion. They had no attendance, but the church was surprisingly full. The neighbors who had seemed to abandon Willa came out for the wedding, and she realized with a start that perhaps she'd been wrong about their withdrawal. Maybe they'd just been giving her space to grieve, unsure how to help someone so fiercely independent. Mrs. Johnson from the next farm over hugged her after the ceremony, tears in her eyes. "I'm so happy for you, dear. You deserve this happiness, and your young man seems like a good sort." Even Mr. Jennings from the general store was friendly, shaking Quinn's hand and telling him he was getting a fine woman. Constance Martin was notably absent, but Willa found she didn't care. She was too happy to waste energy on old resentments. They spent their wedding night in Willa's house, which was now their house, in the bedroom that had been her parents'. Quinn was gentle and patient, and Willa felt cherished and desired in equal measure. It was everything a wedding night should be, tender and passionate and full of discovery. Afterward, lying in Quinn's arms, Willa felt a peace she hadn't known since her father died. She was home, truly home, and she wasn't alone anymore. The following months were a blur of hard work and happiness. They harvested the wheat in late summer, and it was a good crop, enough to pay off Willa's debts at the general store and have some left over. Quinn proved to be everything he'd promised, working tirelessly from dawn to dusk, always looking for ways to improve the farm. He bought a pair of good mules at a fair price, which made the plowing go much easier. He negotiated a better deal for their wheat at the grain elevator, using his natural charm and business sense to get a higher price. But more than his work ethic, what Willa treasured was the partnership they'd formed. Quinn never made decisions without consulting her, never dismissed her opinions or ideas. They were true partners in every sense of the word, and Willa bloomed under that respect and consideration. She'd never realized how much of her strength had been going to simply surviving alone. With Quinn beside her, she had energy for more than just survival. She had energy for living. They talked about their dreams during those long summer evenings. Quinn wanted to expand their livestock holdings, maybe get some cattle to go with the crops. Willa wanted to plant fruit trees, create an orchard that would provide for future generations. Together they planned and schemed, their dreams weaving together into a shared vision of the future. In October, Willa realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but hadn't said anything, afraid to jinx it, afraid to hope too hard. But when she finally told Quinn, his face lit up with such joy that she wondered why she'd waited. "A baby," he said wonderingly, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Willa asked, needing to hear it. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it. Quinn pulled her into his arms. Terrified, excited, overwhelmed, grateful. But mostly just so deeply happy I can barely find words for it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Quinn became even more protective, insisting Willa rest more, taking on additional chores to spare her the heavy work. Willa chafed at the restrictions sometimes but appreciated the care behind them. They spent the long winter evenings preparing for the baby, making tiny clothes and repairing an old cradle they'd found in the barn. Quinn carved a wooden horse and a set of blocks, his hands patient and careful. Their son was born on a warm day in May of 1883, arriving with the spring rains and making his displeasure at the world known with lusty cries. They named him Thomas, after Willa's brother, and William for Quinn's father. The baby was healthy and strong, with Quinn's dark hair and Willa's determined chin. Holding him for the first time, looking at his tiny, perfect face, Willa felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. Quinn was a devoted father from the start. He would wake in the night to walk with Thomas when the baby was fussy, would sing to him in a surprisingly good baritone, would sit for hours just watching him sleep. Willa fell in love with her husband all over again, seeing the gentleness with which he handled their son. "He's perfect," Quinn would say, studying Thomas's miniature fingers and toes. "How did we make something so perfect? I don't know, but I'm glad we did." Willa leaned against Quinn's shoulder, the three of them a complete unit. This was family, she thought. This was what her parents had fought for, what they'd wanted for her. She wished they could see it, but somehow she felt they knew. The farm was thriving, filled with love and laughter again. The cycle was continuing. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the farm continued to prosper. They had good crop years, and Quinn's cattle venture paid off. He'd bought a small herd with their savings, and the cattle thrived on the Nebraska grassland. They sold beef in Taylor and to the railroad, bringing in steady income. Slowly, they were building not just a subsistence farm but a real working ranch. Willa found herself becoming part of the community again. With a husband and child, she was respectable in ways she hadn't been as a woman alone. She made peace with that double standard, even though it still rankled sometimes. What mattered was that she and Quinn were building the life they wanted, and they were doing it together. When Thomas was 2, Willa became pregnant again. This time she knew the signs immediately and told Quinn right away. He swept her into a careful hug, mindful of the precious cargo she carried, and kissed her soundly. "I hope it's a girl this time," he said. "A daughter as strong and beautiful as her mother." "We'll love whatever we get," Willa said, but privately she hoped for a girl too. Their daughter was born in January of 1886, during one of the coldest winters on record. The birth was harder than Thomas's had been, longer and more painful, but when Willa finally held her daughter, she knew it had been worth every moment. They named her Grace Ellen, and she was indeed a beauty, with red gold hair that caught the firelight and eyes that would eventually settle into a clear blue-green. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly, to help with her care. Quinn and Willa watched their children together, marveling at how their family had grown. From a lonely woman working an empty field and a drifting cowboy with no place to call home, they'd built this. A thriving farm, a solid marriage, 2 healthy children, and a future full of promise. "Do you ever regret it?" Willa asked Quinn one night after the children were asleep. They were sitting on the porch as they still did whenever weather permitted, holding hands and watching the stars. "Giving up the wandering life." Quinn looked at her as if she'd asked whether he regretted breathing. "Not for a single second. This is everything I didn't know I wanted. You're everything I didn't know I needed. Every morning I wake up grateful that I happened to ride past this farm on that particular day." "Best detour I ever took." "It wasn't a detour," Willa said softly. "It was fate. It was meant to be." "I believe that." Quinn squeezed her hand. "We were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of farm life and the milestones of their growing children. Thomas grew tall and strong, with his father's steady temperament and his mother's determination. He loved the farm, loved working alongside Quinn with the cattle and crops. Grace was more adventurous, always getting into things, asking endless questions, insisting on doing everything her brother did despite being 3 years younger. They added to the house, building on 2 more rooms as the children grew and needed their own space. Quinn proved to be a skilled carpenter, and the additions blended seamlessly with the original structure. They painted the house white, put up new fences, planted those fruit trees Willa had dreamed of. The farm transformed from a struggling homestead to a prosperous ranch, known throughout the area for the quality of their cattle and crops. In 1890, when Thomas was 7 and Grace was 4, Willa gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named James Quinn. The birth was easier than Grace's had been, and James was a content baby, happy to watch the world go by with his wide gray eyes. He completed their family in a way none of them had anticipated, and both Thomas and Grace doted on their baby brother. Quinn, now in his mid-30s, had settled into the life of a prosperous rancher. The restless young cowboy was gone, replaced by a steady, respected member of the community. He served on the town council and helped organize barn raisings and community events. But he never forgot where he'd come from, and he made a point of helping drifters when they came through, offering work and a fair wage, just as that rancher in Wyoming had helped him. Willa, at 30, had grown into her role as well. She ran the household with efficient grace, managed the kitchen garden and the chickens, and still worked alongside Quinn when extra hands were needed. She hosted quilting bees and church socials, served on the school board, and became known as someone who could be counted on in times of trouble. But her favorite times were still the quiet evenings on the porch with Quinn, talking about their day, making plans, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. One evening when James was about 6 months old, Quinn and Willa sat on the porch watching their older children play in the yard. Thomas was pushing Grace on a swing Quinn had hung from the big oak tree, and her laughter rang out clear and joyous in the evening air. "You remember when this place was quiet?" Willa asked, leaning against Quinn's shoulder. "When it was just me alone, pulling that plow." "I remember a brave woman fighting impossible odds," Quinn said. "I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone so determined or so strong. I remember a man who stopped to help a stranger, who gave up his plans to make sure I'd be okay. I remember thinking he was either a fool or a saint. Turns out I was neither, just a man who recognized home when he saw it." Quinn kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for letting me stay, Willa, for taking a chance on a rootless cowboy with nothing but his word and his willingness to work. Thank you for stopping that day, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for loving me and this land and building this life with me." Willa turned to kiss him properly, a kiss that still held all the passion and promise of those early days, tempered now with the depth of shared years. The children grew, and the farm grew with them. Thomas, at 16, was already bigger than Quinn and starting to talk about his own dreams for the ranch. He wanted to expand the cattle operation, maybe try breeding horses. Grace, at 13, was whip-smart and had her sights set on becoming a teacher. She loved learning and spent hours poring over any books she could get her hands on. James, at 9, was the dreamer of the family, always off exploring the creek or the far pastures, coming home with pockets full of interesting rocks and tales of imaginary adventures. Quinn and Willa guided them all with patience and love, providing a stable foundation from which they could grow. They taught their children the value of hard work, the importance of honesty, and the necessity of kindness. But mostly they taught by example, showing their children every day what a real partnership looked like, what true love meant. In 1899, on a beautiful spring day much like the one when Quinn had first stopped at the farm, they celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary. Their children had planned a surprise party, inviting neighbors and friends from all over the area. The house and yard were full of people, laughter, and music. A fiddler played while couples danced on the packed earth of the yard. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by generous neighbors. Thomas stood up to make a toast, his young face serious and earnest. "Most of you know the story of how my parents met. My father was passing through, saw my mother struggling alone, and stopped to help. What you might not know is how that simple act of kindness changed everything. It gave my mother a partner, my father a home, and eventually gave me and my brother and sister our lives. But it did more than that. It showed all of us what it means to reach out a hand, to help someone in need, to build something lasting based on respect and love. So here's to my parents, to their love, and to the life they've built together. May we all be so lucky." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as people raised their glasses. Quinn and Willa stood together, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, both of them overwhelmed by the love and respect evident in the gathering. This was the life they'd built, the legacy they were creating, and it was good. As the party wound down and the guests departed, as their children helped clean up and then headed to bed, Quinn and Willa found themselves back on the porch, their favorite spot, watching the stars emerge. 17 years, Willa said wonderingly. "It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "Best 17 years of my life," Quinn said, "and I'm looking forward to the next 17 and the 17 after that. We'll be old," Willa teased. "We'll be together." "That's all that matters." Quinn pulled her close. "I love you, Willa O'Connor, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. I love you too. My wandering cowboy who stopped wandering, my partner in all things." She kissed him, a kiss that held the promise of all the years to come. "Thank you for picking up that plow. Thank you for letting me." Quinn smiled against her lips. "Best decision I ever made." The years continued their steady march forward. Thomas married a neighboring rancher's daughter named Sarah when he was 21, and they built a house on the far corner of the property. The ranch was big enough now to support 2 families, and Quinn was glad to have his son working beside him, to know that the land would stay in the family. Sarah was a good match for Thomas, strong and capable, with a sharp wit and a kind heart. She fit into the family seamlessly, and Willa was glad to have another woman in the house, someone to share the work and the conversation. Grace did indeed become a teacher, getting her certificate from the normal school in Lincoln and coming back to teach in Taylor. She boarded with a family in town during the week, but came home on weekends, filling the house with her energy and stories of her students. She was a natural teacher, patient and encouraging, and the children loved her. James, true to his dreaming nature, had wandered a bit after finishing school, but he'd always come back. He was working the ranch now, too, and showing an unexpected gift for breeding and training horses. The O'Connor Ranch became known for quality horses as well as cattle, and James's skill was in high demand. In 1907, Quinn and Willa became grandparents for the first time when Thomas and Sarah had a daughter they named Willa, after her grandmother. Holding her tiny namesake, Willa felt the circle complete itself. She remembered her own parents holding Thomas, their first grandchild they'd never got to meet, and felt grateful beyond measure for this life, for these blessings, for the family that had sprung from that single day when a cowboy stopped to help a struggling woman. Quinn, now in his 50s, had gray threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to Willa, he was as handsome as the young man who'd stopped to help her that day. His body was still strong from years of physical work, his hands still capable and gentle. His eyes still held that same steady kindness that had drawn her to him from the start. They'd weathered hard times together over the years. Drought years when the crops failed, and they'd had to sell some of the cattle to make it through. The winter of '99 when they'd lost half their herd to a blizzard despite their best efforts. Times when sickness swept through, when worry kept them up at night, when money was tight and the future uncertain. But they'd weathered it all together, their partnership strong enough to survive anything, and they'd had good times too. Celebrations and holidays, watching their children grow and flourish, seeing their dreams slowly realized. The quiet satisfaction of a good harvest, the joy of a new foal or calf, the simple pleasure of a job well done. The everyday moments that made up a life, a shared look across a crowded room, a hand held in the darkness, a whispered conversation late at night. Now, as they entered their 60s, they began to think about slowing down, letting the younger generation take over more of the responsibility. Thomas was more than capable of running the ranch, and James was his capable lieutenant. Grace still taught, but had recently begun courting the new doctor in town, a widower named Robert who seemed like a good man. The future of the family was secure. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Willa asked Quinn one evening. They were in their late 60s now, sitting on the porch they'd sat on thousands of times before. The porch had been expanded and rebuilt over the years, but it was still their favorite spot. "Sometimes," Quinn admitted, "I think I would have kept drifting, growing more lonely and bitter with each passing year, never realizing what I was missing. And you?" "I think I would have lost the farm eventually. I was at the end of my strength when you appeared. I would have failed, sold the land, probably moved to Lincoln or Omaha. Spent my life as a shop girl or seamstress, alone and regretful. So we saved each other, really. We did." Quinn squeezed her hand, his fingers still twining naturally with hers after all these years. "Best teamwork of my life." In 1912, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with another big party, this one organized by all three of their children. The grandchildren, now numbering 5, put on a play telling the story of how their grandparents met. Young James, Thomas's 8-year-old son named after his uncle, played Quinn with grave seriousness, wearing his grandfather's old hat and boots that were far too big. His cousin Emma, Grace's daughter, played Willa, dragging a toy plow across the yard while young James came to help. The adults laughed and cried in equal measure, and Willa had to excuse herself for a moment to collect her emotions. Quinn found her behind the barn, wiping her eyes. "You okay?" "More than okay. Just overwhelmed by how blessed we are. Look at what we built, Quinn. A family, a legacy, a life. From nothing we built all of this. We did it together. That was always the secret." Quinn pulled her into his arms, and they stood there for a moment, just holding each other, grateful for every day they'd been given. As they grew older, they gradually handed over more responsibility to Thomas and James. Quinn's joints ached in the morning now, and Willa tired more easily than she once had. But they were healthy and happy, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that what they'd built would continue beyond them. Grace married her doctor in 1913, a small ceremony in the house where she'd grown up. James married 2 years later, bringing home a spirited young woman named Catherine who proved to be just as much of a dreamer as he was. The ranch now had 4 houses on it, a small compound of family, and everyone gathered for Sunday dinners at the main house, the original farmhouse that Quinn and Willa still lived in. Those Sunday dinners were chaos and joy in equal measure, with grandchildren running everywhere, multiple conversations happening at once, laughter and arguments and the comfortable noise of a large, loving family. Quinn and Willa would sit at the head of the table, looking at all the faces around them, descendants of their love, and feel nothing but gratitude. In 1918, as the Great War raged in Europe, Quinn and Willa celebrated their 36th anniversary quietly, just the two of them on the porch. They were in their 70s now, their hair white, their bodies showing the wear of lives fully lived. But they still held hands, still talked for hours, still looked at each other with love. "You have any regrets?" Willa asked, a question they'd asked each other many times over the years. "Only one," Quinn said, and Willa looked at him in surprise. "I regret that I can't live it all over again. I regret that this life will end someday and I won't get to spend eternity working beside you, building our dreams, loving you." Willa's eyes filled with tears. "That's the most beautiful thing you've ever said to me. It's true, though. If I had 100 lifetimes, I'd spend every one looking for you, stopping to help you, falling in love with you all over again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they'd worked together for so many years. The fields were planted, the cattle grazed contentedly, and smoke rose from the chimneys of their children's houses. Everything they'd dreamed of had come to pass, and more. "We did good," Willa said softly. "We did better than good. We did great." Quinn lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it with the same reverence he'd shown her on their wedding day. "I love you, Willa O'Connor, for time and for all eternity. And I love you, Quinn O'Connor, my wandering cowboy. My partner, my heart." The evening air was soft and warm, filled with the sounds of their grandchildren playing in the distance, their children's voices calling them in for supper. This was the life they'd built from a single act of kindness, from a cowboy stopping to help a woman in need. This was the love they'd nurtured and grown through hard work and dedication. This was their legacy, solid and true, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together with respect, love, and unwavering commitment. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Quinn and Willa remained on the porch, hands clasped, hearts full, grateful for every moment of the beautiful life they'd created together. And if you'd asked either of them to name the best day of their life, they wouldn't have chosen their wedding day or the birth of their children or any other milestone. They would have chosen that hot day in 1882 when a passing cowboy stopped and picked up a plow, and a lonely woman let him help. That was the day everything changed, the day their real life began. Years continued to roll by in gentle succession, each one adding to the rich tapestry of their shared life. In 1920, Quinn and Willa celebrated their 38th anniversary surrounded by their family in the house that had witnessed so much of their love. They'd seen their family grow to include 12 grandchildren and even 2 great-grandchildren, little ones who carried forward the legacy they'd begun all those years ago. The ranch had expanded far beyond what either of them had dreamed possible. It now encompassed 300 acres of prime Nebraska land, with cattle and horses that were known throughout the state for their quality. Thomas ran the operation with James's help, and both sons had inherited their father's business sense and their mother's determination. The O'Connor name meant something in Taylor and beyond. It meant hard work and fair dealing, and it meant family. On a crisp autumn morning in 1921, Quinn woke before dawn as he always had, his internal clock still set to farmer's hours despite being well into his 70s. He lay for a moment watching Willa sleep beside him, her face peaceful in the gray morning light. She was still beautiful to him, every line on her face a memory, every silver strand of hair a testament to the life they'd lived. He felt his heart swell with love so deep it almost hurt. Willa stirred, opening her eyes to find Quinn watching her. She smiled, that slow smile he'd fallen in love with decades ago. "Morning," she murmured. "Morning, beautiful." Quinn kissed her softly. "How'd you sleep?" "Like always, perfectly, because you're next to me." She stretched carefully, her joints protesting a bit. "What are we doing today?" "Whatever we want. That's the beauty of being old. Thomas and James have everything handled." Quinn got up slowly, offering Willa his hand to help her rise. They moved through their morning routine with the ease of long practice, dressing and making their way to the kitchen, where Willa started coffee and Quinn began gathering ingredients for breakfast. Over the years, Quinn had become an accomplished cook, learning from Willa and adding his own innovations. This morning he made flapjacks and bacon while Willa set the table and poured coffee. They ate together as the sun rose, painting the kitchen in shades of gold, talking about their plans for the day and laughing over something young Emma had said the previous evening. After breakfast, they walked out to the porch together, coffee cups in hand, to watch the ranch wake up. They could see Thomas and James moving around the barns, starting the daily chores. Sarah was hanging laundry, and Catherine was working in her vegetable garden. The grandchildren who still lived on the ranch were emerging from their homes, ready for school or work. "It's a good view," Quinn said, as he'd said 1,000 times before. "The best," Willa agreed, also as she'd done 1,000 times. It was their ritual, their way of acknowledging what they'd built together. As October gave way to November and then December, the family prepared for Christmas. It had become tradition for everyone to gather at the main house on Christmas Eve, a sprawling, chaotic affair that Willa orchestrated with the skill of a general. This year would be the biggest yet, with all 3 children and their spouses, all 12 grandchildren, and the 2 great-grandchildren who were old enough to travel. Willa threw herself into preparations with her usual enthusiasm, but Quinn noticed she was tiring more easily. He urged her to rest more, to let the younger women handle more of the work, but Willa insisted on being involved in everything. She wanted this Christmas to be perfect. The evening arrived, and the house was indeed transformed. The tree Thomas and James had cut from the far pasture stood tall in the corner, decorated with ornaments collected over nearly 40 years of marriage. Candles glowed on every surface, and the smell of roasting turkey and baking pies filled the air. The house rang with laughter and conversation. children's excited squeals, and the warm buzz of family together. After dinner, as was tradition, Quinn and Willa sat in the place of honor while their family gathered around. The grandchildren performed a nativity play they'd been practicing, complete with costumes Sarah had sewn. Emma read the Christmas story from the Bible in her clear teacher's voice. And then Thomas stood to make a toast. "Mom and Dad," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've given us the greatest gift any parents can give their children. You've shown us what real love looks like. You've taught us about partnership and perseverance, about kindness and integrity. Everything good in our lives stems from the foundation you built together. So thank you for everything and Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Quinn and Willa looked at each other, both with tears in their eyes, both thinking the same thing. This was what it was all about. Not the land or the cattle or the money in the bank. This family, this love, this legacy. This was everything. As the new year of 1922 began, Quinn and Willa settled into a comfortable routine. They'd truly retired now, spending their days doing exactly as they pleased. Quinn worked in the workshop he'd built, crafting furniture and toys for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Willa tended a small flower garden and spent hours reading, a luxury she'd never had time for in her youth. They took walks together every afternoon, moving slowly but still covering their beloved land, still holding hands like newlyweds. One warm spring day in April, they walked out to the field where they'd first met, where Quinn had first picked up that plow. It was planted with wheat now, the young green shoots pushing up through the dark earth. They stood together looking at it, remembering. 40 years ago this spring," Willa said softly. "Right here, this is where it all began." "Best day of my life," Quinn said, pulling her close. "The day I found my home." "Our home," Willa corrected. "It was always ours from that very first day." They stood there for a long time, two old people who'd loved each other well, who'd built a life from nothing but determination and partnership. The sun was warm on their faces, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of growing things. It was perfect, exactly as it should be. That evening, sitting on their beloved porch, Willa rested her head on Quinn's shoulder. "I'm tired," she said softly. "Me too," Quinn admitted. "It's been a long, good life. No regrets, not a single one. Only that it has to end someday." Willa looked up at him. "Promise me something, anything. Promise me that when we're gone, when it's just us in whatever comes next, we'll find each other again. That we'll have this again, this love, this partnership." "I promise," Quinn said solemnly. "I'll find you in every lifetime, Willa. That's my vow to you." They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands, hearts full, grateful for every single day they'd been given together. Quinn passed away peacefully in his sleep on a quiet morning in late June 1923, at the age of 76. He simply didn't wake up, going from one rest to another without pain or struggle. Willa found him and knew immediately that he was gone. She sat beside him for a long time, holding his hand, saying goodbye to the man who'd been her partner for over 40 years. The funeral was the largest Taylor had ever seen. People came from all over the state to pay their respects to Quinn O'Connor, the cowboy who'd stopped to help a stranger and built a legacy of love and service. But Willa barely noticed the crowds. Her world had narrowed to a single point of grief. Half of her was gone, the better half, the half that had made her whole. Her children worried about her in the weeks that followed. She seemed to fade, becoming quieter and more distant. But she assured them she was all right, that she was simply adjusting to life without her partner. She still went through her routines, still participated in family gatherings, still smiled at her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But the light had gone out of her eyes, and everyone could see it. On a warm evening in August, exactly 2 months after Quinn's death, Willa walked out to the porch and sat in her usual spot. She could almost feel Quinn beside her, almost hear his voice in the evening breeze. She looked out at the land they'd loved, at the legacy they'd built, and she smiled. "I'm ready," she whispered to the gathering darkness. "I've said my goodbyes. I've seen them all one last time. I'm ready to find you again, my love." That night, Willa Kendrick O'Connor passed away in her sleep, her heart simply stopping, worn out from a lifetime of love and work. When Thomas found her the next morning, she looked peaceful, a slight smile on her face, her hand outstretched as if reaching for someone only she could see. They buried her beside Quinn under the oak tree in the family cemetery on the ranch, the tree where they'd spent countless evenings watching their grandchildren play. The whole family gathered, tears and stories flowing freely, celebrating a love that had endured everything life could throw at it. Thomas found a letter in his mother's desk, written in her careful hand, addressed to all of them. In it, she told them how proud she was of the family they'd become, how grateful she was for every moment of her life with their father. She reminded them that love was the only thing that really mattered, that everything else, the land, the money, the success, was meaningless without love to give it purpose. She told them to hold tight to their partners, to work together through the hard times, to never take a single day for granted. And she told them the story one more time, the story of a woman working a field alone and a cowboy who stopped to help. She wanted them to always remember that one act of kindness could change everything, that reaching out a hand could create ripples that lasted generations. She urged them to be that kind of person, to stop and help when they saw someone struggling, to build rather than tear down, to love rather than judge. Years passed, and the ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's leadership, and then, eventually, under his son James's leadership. The family grew larger, spreading out but always coming back to the home place, always remembering the love story that had started it all. The tale of Quinn and Willa became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what real love looked like. The porch where they'd spent so many evenings was preserved and maintained, becoming a sort of shrine to their memory. Young couples in the family would sit there when they were troubled, seeking the wisdom of ancestors long gone. And more than one person swore they could feel Quinn and Willa's presence there, a warmth and peace that lingered in that special place. The field where they'd met was never sold or divided. It remained part of the original homestead, planted each year, yielding good crops. And sometimes, if the light was just right, if you looked carefully, you could almost see them there. A young woman struggling with a plow, a cowboy stopping to help, the beginning of a love that would echo through time. Their story became more than just family history. It became a testament to what two people could build when they worked together with love and respect. It became proof that sometimes the best things in life came from unexpected detours, from stopping to help a stranger, from taking a chance on love. It became a reminder that home wasn't a place but a person, and that true partnership could weather any storm. The ranch they'd built together continued for generations, each one adding to what Quinn and Willa had started. But no matter how much it grew or changed, the heart of it remained the same. It was built on love, on that moment when a cowboy saw a woman who needed help and stopped, when a lonely woman took a chance on a stranger. That was the foundation, solid and true, and it held everything else up. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave this world, Quinn and Willa were together again, working side by side, loving each other as they always had. Their story had ended on earth, but their love continued, eternal and unbreakable. a light that would shine through all the generations that followed them, a beacon showing the way home,